Hello, good afternoon. This is Mildred Barya with Poetrio this afternoon, and it's my honor to introduce three wonderful poets and also to thank our listeners out there who are here with us. Thank you so much for making the time. We have three poets, and I'm going to introduce them. Then afterwards, I will take a back seat, and the first poet who is going to read is Merle Bachman, and she is the author of Thank You for Being, a poet's memoir of home. Bachman grew up in Albany, New York, the granddaughter of Yiddish-speaking immigrants. She's a poet who delights in writing prose and exploring the arbitrary boundaries between genres. Bachman has published 4 poetry books, as well as poems and other writing in many journals, including Talisman, Five Fingers Review, Tupelo Quarterly, and elsewhere. Thank You for Being, a poet's memoir of home, was published by Wet Cement Press. Still Glimmering is a translation of selected Yiddish poems that will be published this year, which is another project that Bachman has been working on. And there is a link to Bachman's blog/website in case you want to know more about her, and also how to read, how to purchase some of the books, the previous books that she has published. She's going to be our first reader. And our second reader is Devin Ebenbach, author of What's Left to Us by Evening. Ebenbach has published 9 books of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction that include How to Mars, Miss Portland, Some Unimaginable Animal, and the new poetry collection from Orison Books, What's Left to Us by Evening. Ebenbach lives with his family in Washington, D.C., where he teaches creative writing at Georgetown University. And there's also a link provided to go to Ebenbach's blog/website in case you want to read more about his previous publications and how to access them. And then the last reader is going to be Richard Tillinghast, author of Blue If Only I Could Tell You. Tillinghast was born and raised in Memphis. After college at Sewanee, he did graduate work at Harvard. He's the author of 13 books of poetry and 5 of creative nonfiction. He has taught at Harvard, Berkeley, the college program, at San Quentin Prison, the University of Michigan, as well as at Trinity College Dublin and the Poets House in Ireland. He's a founder and past director of the Bear River Writers Conference in Northern Michigan. He currently lives in Hawaii and spends his summers in Tennessee. At the end of the reading, there will be time for questions. So as you listen to these poets and you feel like asking questions, please write it down. We will open up for that and receive your questions. For now, let us welcome Merle Bachman. Thank you.
Hello. I'm really happy to be here. I really appreciate the invitation to read with such esteemed writers, and without further ado, Thank You for Being is a prose poetry hybrid, and as a memoir, it has a poetic structure and it hops around a lot. So what I'm going to be doing is sharing excerpts, samples from the first half of the book, trying to create a bit of an arc for you. But it goes a lot more places. Okay. When you live long enough, you have stepped out of the bodies of your previous selves and can write about them as an observer. And why write only as I? A life comprises many selves, which can be viewed from various subject positions. So sometimes I am M, more often she, or the you I am frequently in conversation with in my head, or the we that, far from royal, is the culmination of our parts and a communing with audience. And of course you write about them, because you've always experienced life through a mesh of words. The only way to remember clearly is to look back at an old notebook or a journal, to a story or a poem you wrote as a teenager, or a 20-something who is herself looking back, where you see the words sail, Canadian, lake, and with these prompts, reassemble what happened. That is, for example, that camp counselor Gary took you out on his sunfish on Lake George, and he tried to teach you how to work the sail, to make it go a boat instead of about, saying it that way because he was Canadian, and that was much more interesting to you than sailing. And also, he was cute, and now you had something that made the other girls give you sidelong looks of semi-respect. Except this is not strictly true. I mean, about remembering. Sometimes memories override the written words or replace them. I met Leonard Cohen at Bodie in New York because Hal and Liz got married there, in New Mexico, because Hal and Liz got married there. And at lunch the day before, he asked me if I would cut his hair back in his cabin. But you never wrote that down. Only that meeting him made you feel shy. A friend has written her credo, revising it over the years, but not much. She is so firmly sure of her beliefs. It is one form of writing that has never attracted you. There is really only one thing you, like Oprah, know for sure. I have always been a poet. And possibly, there's a second in credo language. There is something greater that holds us, that some people call God, but you don't. I could add, if someone asks you to turn left, you will always turn right. If everyone else is doing X, you will refuse it. You define yourself as different. Consider this an embrace of what might otherwise be called not normal, a phrase your father often used regarding you. This is spiting Buddhist admonishments to detach from the kleshas, the feeling patterns that hold us in place, even though you know it's pointless now to remain aloof. Writing is without boundaries. One can write and write and write, as I have done, as I do, and rarely finish anything. It's like bloodletting. Think of the leeches fastened to 19th century poets in need of a TB cure. I want it all to spill through skin, through pores, without cessation. Call me a borderless woman because of my lifelong insistence on gestures of non-commitment to person, place, or thing. Though I've had my cliched Dorothy clutching Toto moments whispering, there's no place like home, there's no place like home. But there isn't a home in the conventional senses, not for me. The credo. Whatever happens, whatever exists, whatever is, there's water beneath it. But choosing to rent, to remain provisional, no matter how many years in a particular city, despite even marriage, to stay singularly intact, no children. The husband came and after much time and struggle went. He provided the structure, then other structures rose to take his place, and I moved on, though the new apartment was technically a 20-minute walk away from the marital home. And I kept writing about it and not publishing because writing is a process and there's never an adequate place to call a halt. So I address myself as follows. Your mother never lived more than 30 miles from her birthplace, But you have lived east and west, and now in the part known as flyover country. And everywhere, you've lived in apartments or with collections of individuals in rented houses where food is labeled in the refrigerator and a chore wheel hangs on the wall. That was in your 20s, 30s. Your abiding choice, apartments, compartments, meant to be temporary zones of habitation, not owned. So you never buy the final set of dishes, the ones for company. You don't shell out for matching silverware. You get by with a desk picked up off the sidewalk on junk collection day, but you make sure to have sturdy shelving for books, beginning with the ones from college classes and extending from there in row after row after row. Books in the bathroom, in the kitchen, the hallway, floor to ceiling in some cases, because they are, apparently, where you really live, a thread of permanence. Here lives the poet scholar, no matter how shifting external shapes the succession of unsatisfying day jobs. How you missed upstate New York when you made it to California. So even in San Francisco, with its wedding cake hills, its painted ladies, a diorama of gilt splendor, each one more lovingly restored than the next, more expensive. Even in San Francisco, a sense of lack. Hungry for home, the real home, where my mother's family lived, sprawled with cousins and clans across Albany, Rensselaer, and Columbia counties, with pockets downstate, my father's side, claims to New York, the big city, and seasons revolving according to a childhood timetable. Surely home is where the names of places sound beautiful, even if you've never been to those places and have no intention of going. Saugerties, Schaghticoke Creek, Schoharie, Falacia, Warsaw, Soroka, Bessarabia. Embodying poetry. When my knees gave out, after I'd gotten as far as pink satin toe shoes and my parents' marriage gave out, I was left, a studious, middle-class Jewish girl in my confinement of books and poetry. What else could I do but go to college? 1972, Waltham, Massachusetts. My confinement, words unfurling, blossoming. I took my poems into a workshop taught by Adrienne Rich. It was a year after she'd published The Will to Change, and a year before Diving into the Wreck came out. I still have both of the original copies. Each cost $1.95. In the Norton second critical edition of Adrienne Rich Poetry and Prose, I run my finger down the list of the chronology at the back of the book to find the place where my life briefly intersected with hers. 1972-73, Hearst Visiting Professor of Creative Writing, Brandeis University. I had never before heard of this poet. She was friendly but serious. She was always Ms. Rich, but by my second semester of knowing her, she became AR in my journals. I liked her freckled face. Her large, dark eyes burned. A crackling seemed to surround her in the office where we had our individual meetings, with this large round table heaped with papers. Ms. Rich intimidates, stimulates. I can't seem to make small talk with such a person. It would be wasting her minutes. And a weariness surrounded her too. She walked with a cane all the way up the steps of the Usedam building, and filled with excitement, I caught myself running up ahead of her, turning around in embarrassment to say hello. And the above-mentioned Norton chronology is punctuated by many surgeries connected to the rheumatoid arthritis she had lived with since before I was born. I was the only freshman in a class that even had grad students in it, who were writing sonnets and aubades. And me? She let me write whatever I wished. Thank goodness. The exercise for November 21st for English 167A, tucked into my fall 1972 journal, begins with a dense 3-paragraph quote from Erich Neumann, Origins and History of Consciousness, for example, Uroboros incest is a form of entry into the mother, and then offers these choices. Write a poem in which birth is being experienced by the infant. Write a poem in which sexuality is experienced as death. The words sensuous and sensual arise in my journal of that fall, but only related to my writing. I was 18 years old, a virgin, and obsessed with poetry. Every single entry in that journal refers in some fastidious way to my thinking about images, lines, and features, continual rewriting and accreting of each poem bit by bit, and then thinking it through, analyzing it, tearing it down, balking at it, abandoning it, returning to it. And at least I'll have something to show Ms. Rich. I mentioned no other academic experience, just a couple of friends and the various boys on whom I had agonizing, unfulfilled crushes. And ballet, and going to New York City to see ballet, and staying with Judy Wolfe, a woman who had been my student teacher in 7th grade and was the first person I'd shown my poems to. November 10th, 72. What Miss Rich said to me a few weeks ago still holds. The inherent poetry of things. I look at things with wonder. A week later, I write in my journal. I just want to say about this afternoon, I was thinking of making it a poem, but instead, the ducks bobbing on the chapel pond, turning up and down, orange flashing, the straw flowers in the woods, the even beating of the sun, the field all stiff with straw. I paused there a minute, imagining I was a deer with foot lifted among the scraps of snow, intent as the sun upon the soft milkweed that had managed to break from their pods. A November scene, bereft of color or leaves, but beautiful, simple, still. I understood I was under her influence. Spoke to Ms. Rich today. She liked the poem, which made me feel good. She suggested all kinds of things to me, bookstores, anthologies, readings. References to Adrian appear scattershot in my 1972-73 journals. A handful, really, here, there. But she's a figure in the background, a tint, a presence, as I developed the main relationship of my young life with poetry. I'm just going to read a tiny bit more. Once, the poet Philip Levine came to read at Brandeis and visited our workshop. It was soon after publishing They Feed, They Lion, a book of intense, imagistic working-class rage. They feed, they lion, Adrian joked when he took the coffee and snacks that were on offer, and insisted that he read one of my poems, which was about my cousin Ellen's marriage, which had taken place in a rented firehouse outside of Albany, and went in part like this. Bodies thick from making children move easy at weddings. My mother like a girl with an aged face, dancing with her nephews and brothers, again weightless as wedding cake, to melt in his mouth. Your mother, bless her, she's having a fine time. The absence following her like a halo. And when are you getting married? And so on. Levine didn't seem to like my poem very much. I remember how, as they batted comments back and forth about it, they seemed to be commenting on something else, as if they were using the lines in my poem and their differing opinions of them to create a secondary line of communication, something to do with what men wanted, what women wanted. Feminism was becoming a noise around me and a pattern mixed with poetry developing inside my head. A sheltered girl, no understanding of politics, just a feeling about what was raging around in the larger world. I had no measuring stick for Adrian's intensity. The times I entered her office to find her staring off into space, there was, thankfully, no way all those years ago to have put her name into a search engine and found out her husband had committed suicide just 2 years before I sat in her workshop, or that she was starting to discover her latent sexuality as a lesbian. She was a burning brand, stamping the air with ideas I took in because they were poetry and charged up with the passion I aspired to, more as a writer than in my lived experience. Thank you.
Thanks for asking me to unmute, but I'm actually not spotlighted, I don't think. So oh, here we go. Okay. Thank you so much. Merle, that was wonderful. So expansive. I'm just thinking about Leonard Cohen getting a haircut and Adrienne Rich as a burning brand and Wedding Cake Hills and Eastern Europe and leeches and all of it pulled together around poetry. That was wonderful. Thank you. And thanks also to Mildred and Patricia and Stephanie and Malaprops in general, and to everyone who's here today virtually. My name is David Ebenbach, and I think I'm largely here because of my new poetry collection, What's Left to Us by Evening, which just came out from Orison Books this fall. And I'm going to be reading a bit from that, as well as from my other two collections. But I like to start by reading somebody who's not me. So I'm going to read a poem by Stephen Dunn because the emotion in this poem feels like something I was trying to get at in my book, What's Left to Us by Evening. It's his poem, Happiness. Happiness. A state you must dare not enter with hopes of staying. Quicksand in the marshes and all the roads leading to a castle that doesn't exist. But there it is, as promised, with its perfect bridge above the crocodiles and its doors forever open. I love that. So since we're still in the beginning of January, I thought I would read some poems that are sort of resolution-y, because we're maybe all still in our phase of having resolutions for the new year. So I'll start with a poem called Belly, because I understand that's sort of the big thing people work on in the new year or hope to. It's from my first collection, We Were the People Who Moved. Belly. I finally notice it at a dinner party, the way it stretches my shirt, its urgency from the cake I've eaten, its nerdy gurgles all the way home. My wife has noticed it too. She eyes it from her side of the bed. My belly is new topography for us. She says, you really should do something about that. I take it by car to the doctor's office, sit among other people with wrong-sized parts. There is a swollen hand in the lap next to me, a puffy face staring at me over the magazines. When it's my turn, the doctor examines my roundness as though an explorer determined to map me. There may be an alternate route to the Indies laid out somewhere on these curving new lines. Eventually, the doctor relaxes on the rolling stool, assures me that everything will be all right in time. It seems that I have merely eaten too much. If I just eat less, the doctor assures me, the gut will shrink. At the dinner table, my wife and I discuss the situation. She agrees with the doctor. I nod, but I'm not so sure. I eat my normal amount of dinner, though we talk about changes, about reduced portion size and exercise and a long, long life. Then I wash the dishes contemplatively with my belly against the sink. The air in the kitchen and out the open window is a fog of spices. Everywhere is the rising scent of this city and beyond. One thing I do a lot in my poems, if I want to do something or write something, but I don't know how, I just write a poem that says that I'm going to do that thing or write that thing. It's much easier, I found. So this is one, it's sort of resolution-like in that sense. It's called Birds, Etc. It's from the same collection. I'm going to write a memoir just as soon as I get it together and start appreciating life. You know, the beautiful things, birds, etc., flowers, and whatnot, when I can hardly walk a block without stopping, wading through my own awe at every blade of earnest grass. Right now, I mostly notice how the grass breaks the sidewalk as it forces its way into the open, or the way my wife goes allergic when flowers pop up around us, or the bird shit, quite frankly, that streaks the door of my car right where my hand wants to go to close that door. And then I think about how so many people have worked so hard to get a car, but don't have anywhere to go and just want to drive around. And now they've got a handful of excrement and nobody's hand to shake anyway. And that's why the memoir has got to wait. Now I'll dip into this, What's Left to Us by Evening. This one's called Ode to Anger. Anger's a good thing to work on in a year. Ode to Anger. You are an old friend, if not a very good one. You hang out at my ear recommending blood, or your hands, extra hands on the wheel, steering me through the guardrail or into the wall and then throwing the gear so I can back up and hit it again. Not that you're outside of me, you're more like a tide in the brain carrying bad ideas, each one a sealed bottle to smash. Then you're the friend who bolts, me alone with a hand of shards. At night when things could be quiet, you return to hammer together a stage on my pillow and rehearse revenge tragedies where you get all the lines. This one is called Beauty Studies, and it has a lot of quotes from the famous haiku poet Basho. And it's again about sort of trying to move past melancholy, I think you could say. And it's addressed to Basho. Beauty Studies. Teacher, I think I do have that set of nested bowls in my heart this spring morning. But can you talk about the blossoms without mentioning the sense of danger, the snowbank overhead ready to avalanche, or the danger of the blossoms leaving us? Already the snow snows down as I leave to go home, tangled feet. But it's not danger at all, not unless you're me and you can't accept beauty without sharpening knives. So let's say seeing them extends my life 75 more years, 75 more years of not knowing, but doing it under these low, bright clouds. Late in your short life, you still saw them and you warned us the beginning verse should not resemble our faces, budding cherry blossoms. But what about the final verse or the ones in between? Teacher who left us, you cured an aching head with these blossoms and show me how. I'm gonna read just one poem from this other collection from Orison, Some Unimaginable Animal, and then two more from the new book. And then I will relinquish the mic. This is another going to poem. It's called Everything's Going to Be Okay. I'm going to write one of those novels you can't put down. The kind where you don't know what's going to happen and you want to know what's going to happen. So you sneak the book into the bathroom to get a few pages in while your wife thinks you're brushing your teeth or showering. Or you take it to work and hope your workstation walls are high enough to keep the book secret. It's going to be a threat to your marriage and your livelihood, this book, though it'll probably also cut down on overeating and any drinking problems, because who has time for any of that when you're racing to find out whether the main character gets away or love or the bad guy? You'll want to rip and chew your way to the end of the book just to find out. Though, seriously, we both know what's going to happen. The main character is going to get away and love and the bad guy. That's why you bought the book, why you let your life fall apart to read it, because you know that somewhere in the universe, things are in good order. Somewhere justice moves forward and doesn't flip back. And then I'll conclude with these couple of poems from, once again, What's Left to Us by Evening. Another I'm going to poem, Falling. I'm going to write a poem about joy, that thing some poets know about. And the poem will come out in long lines, maybe even a single sentence, so that everyone, the poet and the reader, will be rushing, tumbling almost toward the finish, breath drawing down the throat, and the lines will break into lists of the things that bring pleasure, the scent of leaves at the window, kind of blue, the perfect smoothness of peanut butter in a new jar, a rectangle of light on the bed, the car starting midwinter, untangled fur to the touch. And the reader will collect these things like marbles, like hundreds of marbles in their arms. And partly the joy will come from losing these joys, being unable to hold them. Picture marbles overflowing from your arms, falling to the floor, which is now carpeted, so that their landing is more like the oomph of sudden pleasure deep in the chest. And all around your feet is color, round and bright, and you hesitate to take a single step lest you slip on some of this happiness, fall too heavily among the things you always wanted. And then finally, in honor of the new year, a poem called New. New. I like this place. I like the chair I'm sitting in, the pillow on my lap. I like the way the world has gone dark outside the living room. I like the words living room, so that everything inside gets to show up a second time on the window. I like my shirt cast aside on the floor, natural there like a sleeping cat, and certainly the books next to it are good. One has an orange cover. It's the color of a couch a friend has. Even the puzzled sound of the air conditioner is fine with me. The rug under my bare feet, the dim overhead light, the cardboard boxes I need to break down and take away, my bare feet themselves. None of this is new, this excellence. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Malaprops, for hosting us, and thank you, Mildred, for being our host. It's really a pleasure to hear Merle and David's poems, and you've given us a lot to think about. And I guess every poet's work is a whole world in itself, and that's what's been so interesting for me listening to you guys read. I'm going to read something that has New Year's based as well, David, and it's called Keeping Company. My mother was somebody with a lot of ideas and a lot of initiatives, and one of the things that we did in our family was on New Year's Eve, my mother would hand us these little slips of paper and we would write down our faults. No, wouldn't show them to anybody else, and then we would burn them in the fire. I've never met anybody else whose family did that, but that was the custom in our family. Keeping company. It was New Year's morning. Daddy and my brother were watching the Rose Bowl parade roll past on that tiny black and white TV of ours. Mama was cooking the black-eyed peas as she did every year. I had scrubbed the ham hocks and sliced the vidalias. She always said the black-eyed peas would bring us good luck for the rest of the year. Will it really, Mama? I wondered out loud. Well, I don't know, honey, but let's keep company with the rest of the world and say it does. I was also wondering about the collard greens that were supposed to bring money, which she budgeted severely in the leather account book she kept in her desk. I had made my New Year's resolutions that day I'm talking about and burned my faults the night before in the fireplace after writing them on slips of paper Mama gave us, keeping company with the rest of my now faultless family. Years later, yes, I keep company with the rest of the world. I sing the song everybody sings. I say it's all good. I preach to the choir. I say it is what it is. Does it do any good? Does any of it ever do any good? Here's the book I'm reading from. It was published last year, 2022. It's called Blue, If Only I Could Tell You, and White Pine Press published it. I think a lot about history and the history of our country in particular, the history of the South where I grew up. And I'm going to read two poems now that lead us back into the past. The first one is called Revival. Abandoned on what had been a road, a pickup truck, blue paint purpled by sun, and a Model A Ford stalled on the shoulder of the mountain. Sumac growing up through the horsehair seats, rusty seed pods in league with the rust of the machine. Creeper interlaces the tines of an antique harvester in a field, a cooking pot overturned in the yard. Inside the house, pictures still hang on the walls, though they took their Bible with them. I don't hear the hymns they sang, do you? And what has become of their church? But let this home place speak. Let it tell its story now that the machinery of the world starts to misfire, stall out, and begin its slow deceleration. Maybe it's time to disappear down into the creek bed quick as we can, ahead of what's coming over the mountain, and follow the deer tracks and the strange cries of wild turkeys. Flakes of obsidian, arrowheads, rusty bolts, a cannonball from an old battle bleed into the stream that obliterates our tracks. Could we ride bareback again, plow the earth, hunt and trap, sow and mend, rig a snare to catch the feral pigs, build a tabernacle in the loneliness of the unpeopled mountains? Here's another poem that leads us back into the past, and it also has something to do with the history of my native region, the American South. It's called Two Graveyards. Square columns carpentered by the unfree rose above my head. Leaves swamped the veranda where dirt daubers built their laddered homes, and a wren scolded as I peered into rooms furnished with dust and brokenness. Up the staircase, I guessed there were bed chambers where a family's lineage had been engendered, where children were nursed through illness, eyelids closed with silver coins. At the end of a boxwood lane, I found the family plot, stones enclosed within an iron fence. Next to an obelisk and a Celtic cross, an angel grieved. Names not used anymore, born and dieds, far countries and near counties, a motto in Latin, were chiseled into marble. I traced with my fingertips letters eroded by rain and frost. Where the red clay sloped away, a second gathering of stones surprised me, none larger than a loaf of bread. No words memorialized what remained of hands that chopped and plowed, lifted and carried, wrung the necks of chickens, and rocked the cradle up there in that house where paper roses peeled from the walls. I have two more for you. The first one is called Boat. A door in the afternoon opened. The barometer fell a notch. The day turned inside out. Out over the ocean, I saw ghostings of rain, a granular shimmer of drizzle coming ashore. Big drops saucered on the banana leaves, and when I hoisted an umbrella and walked out into it, the rain said something to the umbrella I raised. It was the opposite of big-shouldered or insistent, but steel wouldn't have stood a chance against it. And who was I in the midst of it all? The highest good, the highest good is like water, Lao Tzu wrote. Water gives life to the 10,000 things and does not strive. I wanted to be a leaf buoyed up by the current on a river a child imagines while he plays in the gutter in a rainstorm. It's raining in the story too, and they're out in a boat, the boy and his dog. Well, the way it's worked out for me, as Mildred mentioned, I was born in Memphis. Turns out I've done a lot of traveling in my life and lived in a lot of different parts of the world. And yeah, it's just worked out that way. Travel, I guess I've lived kind of a nomadic life. And here's a poem that reflects a little bit of that wandering spirit. It's called A Way Station in the Punjab. I don't know if you know where that is. It's there used to be East Pakistan and West Pakistan, and now East Pakistan is Bangladesh, and Pakistan is that part of, it's like used to be the Northwest frontier when in India. And I was traveling to India from Afghanistan. You could still, when I made this trip, this was before the horrible recent history of Afghanistan. People like me Americans could still go to Pakistan, and this was, I had just made my way into Pakistan. A way station in the Punjab. A scattering of impromptu lean-tos under trees among grasslands. A well and a pump for washing. A camp kitchen where soup bubbled. An open-air prayer space swept at dawn, sprinkled throughout the day to keep the dust down. They gave me a place to roll out my bedding, read, and make sense of my travels. The stars and planets burned through blackness and astonishment, pure diamond, apple green, and scarlet. I dreamed of apples dropping through the Milky Way. I was a young man then, without complications, before the wars of religion, before the towers burned. Borders were open. Travelers found a welcome. People were kind. Then history swerved, and the world reverted to chaos. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And at this point, I would love to appreciate everybody who has shared their poems with us. So thank you, Merle Bachman. Thank you, David Ebenbach. And thank you, Richard Tillinghast. I have a question for all of you, and it's basically why poetry? Because I understand that you write in other genres as well. So feel free to give us your responses, and anybody could begin. We could begin with you, Richard, since you're still, on the screen, and then David and Mar could also respond.
I find I read a lot of poetry, and one of the things I read a lot of everything, but one of the things I enjoy about poetry is it just seems to go deeper. I mean, it shows us we go beyond the surfaces, and we're in a world that has such inner meaning. I love going into that place. I love going beyond the surface, and I think poetry reveals that kind of world that you could call magic, or just like meaningful or more resonant, and that's what I value about poetry, and I feel so lucky to be spending my life trying to go into those places, find those places, explore those places. That's what I would say, Mildred.
Thank you.
I can jump in and offer my thoughts on this. That word explore resonates with me. I will say I don't totally know the answer to this question. I don't know why poetry for me. I just know that sometimes some of my explorations want to be poems, other ones want to be stories, other ones want to be novels. And it looks from where I'm sitting like the things that want to be poems are things that are about digging into a moment really closely, about not worrying so much about this happened, then this happened, then this happened, the sort of the cause and effect, but sort of just dwelling, to use that word that Richard just used, in a deep way, in a thing, in a moment. And if I try to write that as a story or a play or something, it doesn't work and I have to switch it. So that's as close as I can come to an answer.
Thank you.
From the beginning, poetry for me has been about language and sound, and I guess I've been through various stages and styles of writing, but I used to try to craft the lyric poem, the beautiful object, and And I was relieved when I found out in my MFA program from a poet named Stephen Ratcliffe that no, you really don't have to do that. You can pretty much be an experimenter. And he had introduced our workshop to the language poets and beyond. And but these days, I guess I'm at the point where I feel like, why I'm not even going to keep poems separate from things I'm writing in prose right now on the computer, because it's all writing, and it's all, my prose tends to be poetic. Sometimes my poetry can be, long lines. So, and to me, it just comes at this point in my life. It's just the writing. Yeah.
Thank you. And I do notice that we do not have a question from the audience, which means you've done a great and fantastic job. Everybody's happy. And thank you so much for sharing your work with us. And I look forward to seeing some of you again when we show up in person for the Feb Poetrio reading, which is going to be on 5th. So thank you so much for being with us, and keep writing.